Welcome to the cold asterisk. So, picture this. You're in Britain. It's the year 500 something. The Roman Empire's gone. Roads are falling apart. People are fighting over scraps of land. There's no central heating, no electricity, no corner store with hot chocolate. Just you, your goat, and a very, very long winter. Welcome to the Dark Ages. The name sounds dramatic, but it wasn't called that because everything was pitch black. It was more like a time of chaos and cold toes. A time when surviving the winter wasn't cozy. It was an extreme sport. Winter wasn't a vibe. Let's be honest. Winter can be kind of magical now. We've got fuzzy socks, snowflake lights, heated blankets, and mugs of overpriced coffee. But for Dark Age Britons, winter was not a vibe. It was something you endured. Cold wasn't just outside. It was everywhere, inside your house, in your bones, in your soup. Which, by the way, was mostly just hot water with a suspicious root floating in it. The sky turned gray and stayed that way for months. Days were short, nights were long, and if you didn't have enough food or firewood, things got bleak. Fast. No Romans, no real a couple centuries earlier. The Romans had built bathhouses, roads, and heated villas. Then they packed up and left, and everything started falling apart. Towns crumbled, trade slowed down. People moved into small villages and started living off the land. There was no central government, no emergency services, no insulation. If your roof caved in during a snowstorm, you had to fix it yourself, or just live with a hole and hope nothing important froze. Dark Age life was basically DIY survival mode, on hard difficulty. What did cold even mean? Now, let's talk about the kind of cold we're dealing with. This wasn't Arctic level freezing all the time, but British winters were still damp, windy, and miserable. It wasn't just the temperature, it was how the cold got into everything. Clothes never really dried, floors stayed damp. Your bed felt like a stone slab unless you had 10 layers of scratchy wool blankets. And remember, no thermostats, no double-glazed windows, not even a draft stopper, just a smoky fire in the middle of the room, maybe a clay wall, and a desperate hope that the wind would take the night off. Not much privacy. I fear you didn't have your own cozy bedroom. Families, sometimes extended ones, all shared one big room. You, your parents, your siblings, a couple of pigs, and maybe a chicken or two, all snoozing together for warmth. Privacy wasn't really a thing. But hey, if your feet were freezing, at least you could shove them under a sibling and pretend it was love. The sounds of winter forget peaceful silence. Winter in a Dark Age village had its own soundtrack, the wind howling through the trees and, sometimes through your walls, coughing. So much coughing. The crackle of damp logs that didn't really want to burn. Animals snorting and shifting around indoors. Someone sneezing dramatically in the corner. It wasn't quiet. It was just low-tech loud. Staying alive was a full-time job. Every winter came with the same question: did we store enough food to make it through? If the answer was no, you were in trouble. Hunting was harder in winter. Farming was out of the question. And if your salted meat stash ran out, it was back to boiled roots and stale bread. You couldn't run to the shop for more supplies. Your only delivery service was your own legs. And chances are, the path was frozen over and full of ankle-deep mud. Survival meant planning. It meant rationing. It meant hoping the goats didn't get sick. And sometimes, it meant going hungry, but people kept going. Here's the thing, though, as brutal as it all sounds, people survived, year after year, century after century. They figured out how to work with the seasons. They passed down knowledge, how to build better huts, how to layer clothes, how to spot frostbite before you lost a toe. Kids learned early how to help gather kindling and patch leaky roofs. And when spring finally showed up, oh, it felt like a miracle. Birds chirping, grass poking through, sunlight that didn't feel like a rumor. We'll get to that later. So, Why didn't everyone just move south? Great question. But remember, in the Dark Ages, moving wasn't easy. You didn't just call a moving cart and head to Spain. People were tied to their land, their families, their lords. They lived where they were born. And they stayed there until they died. Plus, Southern Europe had its own problems. Wars, plagues, taxes. The cold was awful, but at least it was familiar. The cold was a constant till the end. Winter was just part of life. It shaped how people lived, ate, dressed, and even prayed. It was a force to be endured, not defeated. And that's the world we're stepping into for the rest of this series. From woolly cloaks to smoky fires, from root cellars to snow-covered fields, we're about to explore all the weird, clever, and, frankly, uncomfortable ways Dark Age Britons made it through the coldest months. So pull up a scratchy wool blanket. Stoke the imaginary fire. We've got 14 more chapters of winter survival to go. Building a winter-proof hut so you've decided to survive winter in Dark Age Britain. Step 1. Shelter. You're gonna need a place to sleep. Store food, keep warm, and maybe even smuggle in a sheep or two. But let's be clear, you're not building a fancy cottage in the Cotswolds. You're building a hut. And by winter-proof, we mostly mean it probably won't fall down if the wind isn't too strong. Let's take a look at what you've got to work with. Materials, mud, sticks, and hope. First off, no bricks, no concrete, no insulation. Your building materials are whatever's nearby: trees, grass, clay, and a lot of wishful thinking, walls. You're making them out of something called wattle and daub. Wattle is just a woven lattice of thin wooden sticks. Think big basket. Daub is the stuff you smear all over it, a delightful mix of mud, straw, hair, dung, and anything else sticky that isn't food. It's kind of gross. But when it dries, it forms a decent barrier against wind and rain, at least for a while, until a pig rubs against it too hard. The roof. One big pile of grass. No. Let's talk thatch. That's your roof, and it's made of dried straw, reeds, or long grasses stacked thick and tied down with rope or twine. When done right, a thatched roof sheds water like a champ. When done wrong, it leaks like a sieve and becomes a playground for rats and birds. And in winter, the straw can freeze solid. Some poor soul has to climb up there regularly to patch holes. It's slippery, dangerous, and miserable. Basically the medieval version of gutter cleaning. The floor, just the ground, and expect floorboards. In most huts, the floor is the earth, bare, cold, packed dirt. Maybe you throw down some old rushes or straw to soak up mud and spills. Eventually, that stuff rots and smells like feet. It's not glamorous, but hey, you're not here to impress anyone. Doors and windows. Kinde or door is probably a wooden slab hung on leather hinges. It doesn't shut tight, and the wind always finds a way in. Windows, if they exist at all, are just holes. No glass. Maybe a cloth covering or a wooden shutter if you're lucky. In winter, you keep them closed, not for privacy, but so you don't freeze solid in your sleep. The fire. Warm and dead. Every hut has a fire, usually right in the middle of the room. It's your heater, stove, night light, and mood setter, all in one. But here's the thing. No chimney. The smoke just drifts upward and hopefully finds its way out through a hole in the roof. In theory. In practice, your entire house fills with smoke. Your eyes sting. You cough a lot. Everything you own smells like a bonfire. And if the fire gets too big, the roof might catch fire. So there's that. Furniture. Minimal and multitasking. There's no IKEA in the Dark Ages. Furniture is handmade. If you have any at all, a bench might also be your bed. A crate might be a table. People slept on straw mattresses stuffed with hay, old wool, or animal skins. If you had a chair with a backrest, you were basically royalty. Most daily life happened sitting on logs, crouching on the ground, or just standing. Nobody lounged. Lounging was for the afterlife. Bring in the animals. Remember how he said sheep might be inside? That wasn't a joke. In winter, people often shared their huts with animals, pigs, chickens, maybe a cow or two, not just for companionship, though pigs are kind of sweet, but for warmth. Body heat is body heat, even if it comes from a snoring goat. Downside: your house smells like a barn, because it is one. Upside: free heating system, plus breakfast laid right there on the floor by your chicken roommates. One big room for everything. Most huts were just a single room where everything happened: sleeping, cooking, eating, arguing, repairing tools, spinning thread, and yelling at the dog. There were no walls, no privacy. You slept next to the fire with your family, your animals, your muddy shoes, and your thoughts. Not super comfy, but at least you weren't freezing outside. Keeping the heat in. You did what you could to trap heat. Hang old cloaks over the door, stuff straw in wall cracks, huddle under piles of itchy wool blankets. Every bit helped, but the fire couldn't reach every corner. Your toes were always cold. And if you rolled away from the hearth in your sleep, you'd wake up with a frozen nose and a regret. Was it all miserable? Honestly, sometimes. Yes. Dark Age huts were cold, damp, smoky, and crowded. They didn't age well. Roofs leaked, walls sagged, fires smoked. The dog always took the warm spot, but people made it work. They gathered close, they told stories, they patched holes. They sang songs while fixing roofs, and sometimes they laughed about it, because what else are you gonna do when a squirrel falls through the ceiling? So, did these huts actually work? Let's not sugarcoat it. These homes weren't exactly weatherproof. But for the time, they were good enough. They gave you shelter from wind and rain. They kept out most of the snow. They helped you survive. And, in the Dark Ages, survival was the goal. Everything else, comfort, style, personal space, was a bonus. What they were: hint. Lots of wool. Okay. Let's set the scene again. It's winter in Dark Age Britain. You've got your leaky hut, your smoky fire, your chicken roommate named Cluckles. Now comes the big question. What are you wearing? Spoiler alert. It's not a sleek thermal hoodie or fleece-lined leggings. You're probably wrapped in several layers of itchy wool, smelling faintly of sheep, smoke, and survival. Let's dive into the winter wardrobe of the past. It wasn't glamorous, but it got the job done. Wool, then more wool. Wool was the Dark Age fashion MVP. Why? Because it was warm, available, and sheep weren't going anywhere. People sheared their own flocks, spun the wool into yarn, and then wove it into cloth by hand. It took forever, so that scratchy tunic you're wearing, yeah, someone spent weeks making that. Don't spill turnip soup on it. Wool kept you warm even when it was damp, and in Britain, it was always damp. Was it soft? No. Was it stylish? Also no. But it worked. Basic outfit. Layered and lumpy. A regular person's winter outfit looked something like this. Linen, under tunic. This was your base layer. Not very warm, but it helped stop the wool from itching you to death. Woolen tunic. This was your main layer. Thick, long, probably stained with something unidentifiable. Wool leggings or leg wraps. Your legs needed love too. If you couldn't afford proper trousers, you just wrapped strips of wool around your shins and hoped for the best. Cloak or mantle. The big finish. A heavy rectangle of wool fastened with a brooch. Doubled as a blanket, a hood, or a fashionable picnic rug. Everything was layered and baggy. Fashion in the Dark Ages was more about not freezing than looking cute. Feet first into the mud shoes. Well, sort of. You might have had leather-turned shoes. These were soft, thin, and handmade. Picture a ballet slipper, but muddier and colder. They didn't have soles like modern boots, so people stuffed them with straw, moss, or rags for warmth. It helped, a little, until they got wet, which was always. Socks were rare, and not exactly fluffy. Some people, Us wrapped their feet in wool. Others didn't bother. Frostbite wasn't fashionable, but it was common. Hats, hoods, and hair situations, a lot of body heat escapes from your head. Dark Age folks knew that, so they covered it up with woolen hoods, sometimes attached to cloaks caps, which looked kind of like sad beanies cowls. For extra monk vibes, hats were practical. They also hid the fact that you hadn't bathed in a week and your hair was doing whatever it wanted. As for grooming, combs existed. People used them, but shampoo, conditioner, not in the picture. Your best bet was rain, gloves, and mittens. If you were lucky, hand coverings were not standard. If your hands were cold, you put them under your armpits or wrapped them in extra fabric. Actual gloves or mittens were kind of fancy. Working outside, you just accepted that your fingers would turn into icicles. It built character, or at least calluses. Clothes equals wealth. Here's a fun fact. In the Dark Ages, clothing showed off your status. The richer you were, the more layers you had. You might wear brightly dyed wool if you could afford the dye, fancy embroidery, or even, gasp, imported fabric. The poor, one tunic, patched again and again. No colors, just earthy tones, brown, gray, maybe green if you got grass stains. So, if you walked into a village dressed in deep red wool with silver thread, people would either assume you were a noble, or that you stole from one. Keeping it together. Belts and brooch, no zippers. No buttons, just belts, pins, and clever folding. A leather belt helped keep your tunic from flapping in the wind. It also held tools, knives, and the occasional pouch of dried peas. Brooches, usually made of bone or bronze, were used to pin cloaks in place. They were useful and one of the few ways to express personal style. Think medieval accessories, but functional. Without them, your outfit might just fall off, not ideal in the middle of winter. Clothes weren't disposable. Here's something wild. Clothes were valuable. You didn't just toss them out if they got ripped. You fixed them, over and over. People passed clothes down through families. A good cloak might last decades. If it wore out, it became a blanket. If that wore out, it became rags. And even the rags got reused, for bandages, for stuffing shoes, or for cleaning up after the goats. Today's fast fashion would have blown their woolly minds. The smell of survival. Let's talk hygiene. In winter, washing clothes was hard, water was cold, soap was rare, and laundry day wasn't exactly a cheerful event. Most people wore the same outfit for days, even weeks, at a time. The result? Let's just say earthy doesn't quite cover it. You smelled like smoke, sweat, sheep, and onions. But so did everyone else. So it wasn't gross, it was just community. Scent. So, was it all terrible? Surprisingly, no. People adapted. They learned how to layer, how to spin, weave, and sew, how to dress kids in hand-me-downs that went through 5 cousins, how to survive with whatever fabric they could get. Fashion might have been lumpy, itchy, and not at all waterproof, but it worked, and when you curled up by the fire at night, wrapped in 3 tunics and a goat hair cloak, you probably felt pretty lucky to have anything warm at all. Staying warm without firewood, because everyone was poor *, so you've got your hut. It's leaky, smoky, and there's probably a goose watching you from the corner. But hey, it's home. Now the next challenge. Staying warm. In modern life, you just flick a switch or crank a thermostat. But in Dark Age Britain, if you wanted heat, you had to make it yourself. And the first ingredient was always firewood. The only problem: firewood was a luxury, and most people, not exactly rolling in logs. The great firewood shortage. See, firewood wasn't just lying around in neat little stacks. It had to be chopped, hauled, dried, and stored, all by hand. Trees weren't unlimited either. In fact, many areas were already deforested from earlier farming, shipbuilding, and war. And if you were poor, which you probably were, you didn't own your own forest. The local lord probably did. You might be allowed to gather some sticks, but chopping down trees without permission, that could get you punished, like, lose a hand punished. So yeah, firewood was tricky. Alternative heat source number 1. Body heat. Good old human warmth. It's free, abundant, and slightly awkward. Dark Age families would huddle together at night. Parents, kids, elders, sometimes animals, all snuggled up under heavy cloaks and blankets. The more bodies, the warmer it got. It wasn't exactly luxurious, but if you were cold enough, even your uncle's snoring breath on your neck felt like a gift. Alternative heat source number 2. Animals. Again, that's right. Your trusty livestock didn't just provide milk and eggs. They doubled as portable heaters. Pigs, cows, goats, dogs, all invited to the cuddle party. In winter, animals were often kept indoors, not just for warmth, but because letting them outside meant risking frostbite, wolves, or just losing them in the snow. Was it a little gross? Sure, but those pigs gave off serious warmth, plus, you didn't have to chop them like firewood. Alternative heat source number 3. Peat and dung. Firewood too expensive. No problem. Just burn other stuff. Peat. This was like soggy, decomposed plant matter, dug from marshy areas. Once dried out, which took forever, it made a decent, slow-burning fuel. Dung? Yep, dried animal poop. It burned hot and slow. Smelled awful, obviously, but when your toes are about to fall off, you stop being picky. In the right conditions, a pile of dung was the Dark Age version of central heating. Just don't toast bread over it. Alternative heat source number 4. Hot rocks and clay potters. A clever little trick. Heat up stones or clay pots in the fire, then move them to the sleeping area. They'd radiate heat for a while, not long, but enough to make bedtime slightly less miserable. Some people buried hot rocks in ashes or sand to keep the warmth longer. Basically an ancient version of a hot water bottle. Just, ROCKIER. Keep the heat in with so little fuel. It was crucial to trap every bit of warmth you had. People got creative. Block the door with animal hides or heavy fabric. Plug wall gaps with straw, moss, or mud. Hang cloaks across sleeping areas to make little heat traps. Build sleeping platforms slightly off the cold ground. And remember, the smoke from the central hearth, while terrible for your lungs, did help warm the space. So yeah, you were coughing, but also sweating. When lose a smoke, the uninvited guess. No chimney meant the smoke hung around for a while before eventually drifting out a hole in the roof. If you had one, this turned huts into fog machines. Eyes burned, babies cried, and everything smelled like you'd just come out of a bonfire. But that smoke helped dry the air and even kept bugs away. Bonus, you were already halfway smoked like a ham. So, if the fire ever did go out, you might stay preserved. Fires were precious. Fires weren't easy to start. You couldn't just strike a match. You had to find dry tinder. Good luck in a rainstorm. Use flint and steel, or a bow drill if you were extra hardcore. Pray the sparks caught. Because of that, fires were never left to die unless absolutely necessary. People banked the coals at night, burying them under ashes to keep them smoldering until morning. If the fire did go out, you'd beg a neighbor for hot coals, or trudge through the cold to the village hearth, a communal fire, if one existed. Sleeping close, breathing slow. But time was a strategy. You didn't just climb into bed, you layered up for battle. Wool tunic on, cloak on, extra straw bedding. Absolutely. Sleep with your boots on. Sometimes. Yes, you curled into a tight ball with your back to the coldest wall and your feet as close to the fire as you dared. And if someone in the group had warm feet, you didn't ask questions. You just borrowed that warmth and said thanks. Heat was a team sport. Serving winter wasn't just about gear. It was about teamwork. Families worked together to gather fuel, repair roofs, and patch up clothes. No one got through the cold alone. If someone's fire went out, a neighbor might share theirs. If a cloak ripped, a cousin might lend theirs. If the baby was crying, everyone tried to help, mostly so they could all get back to sleep. It was messy. It was smoky. It smelled like wet wool and goat farts. But it worked. So, was it warm? Not really, but it was warm enough to keep going, to get through one more night, to tell another story by the fire, to see the sun rise through frosty mist and know you made it, because in the dark ages, that was the goal, not comfort, not luxury, just survival, and if you could, do it with all your toes still attached, even better. The daily grind, winter chores *. So, it's winter in dark age Britain. You're cold, tired, and your boots still haven't dried out from yesterday. You're wrapped in 3 tunics and a goat-smelling cloak. Naturally, it's time to get up and do your chores, because guess what? The cows don't care that your toes are frozen, the fire won't feed itself. And those root vegetables in the cellar won't dig themselves out of the dirt, even in the dead of winter. Life didn't pause, it just got a little muddier. First light, which was basically mid-morning. Dark age winters meant long nights and very short days. Sometimes the sun didn't rise until after 8 a.m., and it was already dimming by 3 or 4 in the afternoon. So most folks didn't exactly leap out of bed at dawn. It was more of a slow, shivering crawl out from under the blankets once the fire was poked back to life. Breakfast, probably a chunk of stale bread, a mug of weak ale, or a spoonful of cold porridge. Then it was time to start the grind. Feeding the animals and yourself first up. Livestock, you had to feed the chickens, pigs, maybe a couple of sheep or a milk cow. In winter, they couldn't graze, so you had to give them hay, scraps, or whatever you could dig out of your dwindling stores. And remember, they're probably living in your hut. So step 1 of feeding them was avoiding whatever they left on the floor overnight. After the animals ate, you got to eat. But don't get excited. Food was usually cold, bland, and recycled from last night's meal. Maybe some boiled peas, maybe some cheese that had seen better days. Fire maintenance, a whole job on its own. Hearth was the heart of the house, and it needed babysitting. You couldn't just let the fire die. That meant constantly adding fuel, whatever scraps you had, raking ashes, and shifting the coals to heat your pot of soup. That single quotes as actually water. If you were lucky, the fire stayed alive all night. If not, someone had to run to a neighbor's hut or the village hearth and beg for embers. And no one wanted to be that person. Water duty, a chilling experience. Heat water. There's no sink. You had to bundle up, grab a bucket, and trudge to the nearest stream or well, which might be half frozen. You chipped through ice with a stick or rock, filled the bucket, and then dragged it back. Bonus, if you spilled any, your hands instantly went numb. Bonus, if you slipped on the ice, the bucket probably landed on your foot. Getting water was such a pain that people reused it as much as possible. Bathwater might also be dishwater. Dishwater might also be laundry water. Laundry water, probably just tossed outside to freeze. Food prep, roots, gruel, repeat. Winter meals weren't glamorous. You boiled what you had: turnips, leeks, dried beans, old grain, or salted meat if you were lucky. It cooked slowly over the fire. Sometimes all day. The house smelled like vegetables and smoke, which was nice, until you realized it would always smell like that. Grinding grain into flour was a whole thing too. You had to use a hand quern, a sort of stone donut you spun endlessly to crush dry kernels. It took forever. Your arms hurt, and the bread still tasted like sadness. Clothing repairs and wool stuff. You couldn't just buy a new sweater if yours got a hole. Everything had to be mended by hand. People spent dark afternoons sewing, patching, spinning wool, or weaving. Kids learned young how to thread a needle, and even older folks with shaky hands still tried to fix cloaks or make socks. The goal was simple: Keep everything in working order until spring. Or at least until your pig chewed another hole in your sleeve. Wood, dung, and mystery fuel. Every family needed fuel. If you were lucky, you had a pile of wood outside. If not, time to get creative. Scavenge sticks from the woods. Collect dried dung from the animal pen. Burn that one broken tool no one liked. Winter chores often included scraping the land for anything that could catch fire. Kids might be sent to gather pine cones or scrape moss off trees. Yes, moss, if it dried right. It kind of burned. Cleaning. Sort off. No mops, no brooms. Just rushes or straw spread on the floor and replaced when things got gross. If something spilled, you scooped it out with a wooden shovel and pretended it didn't happen. Clothes were rarely washed, and when they were, it was an event. You'd heat water over the fire, dump it into a big tub, scrub with ashes or lye, and hope it didn't freeze mid-scrub. Most people waited until spring. Taking care of the sick. Winter was peak time for coughs, chills, fevers, and mystery diseases. If someone in the family got sick, the whole hut slowed down, chores shifted, soup got thinner, people made herbal brews and mumbled prayers. You bundled the sick person in every blanket available and hoped they made it through the week. If not, well, someone had to dig a grave in the frozen ground. Another winter chore. Sadly, night comes early. Late afternoon. It was already getting dark. Fires were stoked for the night. Tools packed away. Animals fed again. Cloaks shaken out and beds made with hay or wool. Evening chores included tending to the fire again, checking the roof for leaks, listening for wolves or bandits. It happened. Coughing a lot and pretending it was fine. Finally, you'd eat dinner, usually more of the same stew from earlier, and collapse near the fire, not because you were lazy, but because you were done. A day in the very cold leaf. So yeah, winter days weren't filled with feasting and storytelling all the time. Most of the time, they were packed with tasks, repetitive, dirty, exhausting tasks, but everyone pitched in, even the kids, even grandma, even the slightly confused goat, and as long as the fire kept burning, and the stew kept bubbling, and the roof stayed mostly up, you were doing okay. One day closer to spring. What was on the winter menu? So, it's winter. You're a dark age Briton. You just spent all day hauling water, feeding animals, and stepping in things you wish you hadn't. Finally, you settle down near the fire. Your stomach growls. It's dinner time. Now here comes the hard part, because your winter menu. It's not exactly gourmet. Welcome to the Root Vegetable Club. Let's start with the VIPs of the winter kitchen. Root vegetables. If it grows underground and doesn't rot immediately, it's on the table. Turnips, carrots, parsnips, onions, leeks, maybe a potato. But only if time travelers dropped one off early. These guys were stored in cellars, pits, or baskets of straw. Some were dried, some were pickled, most were just cold and shriveled by February, but they were food, kind of. And if you were lucky, they didn't taste too much like dirt. Soup, stew, and the art of boiling everything. Your winter kitchen didn't have a menu. It had one rule: boil it. Stews were the backbone of survival. You toss in whatever you had: a turnip, some old beans, a hunk of dried meat, a few wilted greens, and simmer it all in a pot over the fire for hours. The longer it boiled, the better. Not just for flavor, but because it helped kill whatever weird bacteria had taken hold of your storage barrel. Some families kept a pot going for days. You'd eat some, add more water and stuff, then eat it again. It was like medieval slow cooking, but with way fewer spices and way more mystery. Meat. A special guest appearance when there wasn't meat heavy, unless you were rich, or lucky enough to have slaughtered a pig in the fall. Salted pork was the most common preserved meat. It was tough, chewy, and probably very salty. Like, drink entire bucket of water after salty. Other options included dried fish if you lived near water, smoked eels, surprisingly common, a suspicious rabbit that just showed up, leftover goose from a festival. If no one beat you to it, most families ration meat very carefully. A little bit in the stew went a long way. A big chunk was for celebrations. And sometimes there just wasn't any bread. If you had grain, and a lot of patience, bread was a staple. When you had flour, grain like barley or rye had to be ground by hand using a cornstone, which took forever. You'd kneel on the floor, spin a heavy stone over another one, and try not to cry. Once you had enough flour, you made a flat, dense loaf. It wasn't fluffy or fancy. Think more like a tough pancake with ambitions. Baking was done over coals or on hot stones. Ovens were rare unless you lived in a monastery or manor. And yeah, sometimes you ate it stale or moldy, or dunked it in stew until it gave up. Dairy, if the cow didn't freeze, cows didn't produce much milk in winter. It was cold, they were grumpy, and food was scarce. But if you had a good cow and some leftover summer butter stored in a clay pot, you were doing pretty well. Winter dairy included very hard cheese, very sour milk, very little of it stole. Any dairy was a luxury. A lump of butter on your bread was the closest you got to joy. Preserved stuff, salt, smoke, and pickle power. Preserving food was an art form and a survival skill. People used salt, smoke, vinegar, and sheer desperation to keep food from going bad. In winter, you might find pickled cabbage or onions, dried berries, smoked nuts or seeds, jars of honey or vinegar, that one dried apple you were saving for a holiday. They weren't big meals, but they added flavor, which was a big deal. In a world where seasoning meant, is there mud in this? Ale, safer than water, could be risky. Streams froze, wells got contaminated. So people often drink ale, even kids. It wasn't strong, more like liquid bread with bubbles. But it was boiled during brewing, which made it safer to drink. You'd sip a little with every meal, and maybe more on cold nights. It didn't exactly warm you up, but it made things feel warmer, which was close enough. Snacks, if you were lucky. Dark Age snacks weren't chips or cookies. They were roasted nuts, dried fruit, maybe crusty bread dipped in broth, a lick of honey on a stick. If you had something sweet, it was a big deal. Sugar wasn't around yet. Honey was prized and rare. So most sweet cravings were just ignored, or satisfied with an especially juicy carrot. What about feasts? Even in winter, there were feast days. Christmas, Saints' Days, or midwinter festivals sometimes brought special meals. On those days, you might roast an animal, bake better bread, or share ale with neighbors. It was a chance to really eat and break up the gloomy season. But feast food didn't last long, and the next day, it was right back to boiled turnips and thin porridge. When food ran out, be February or March, things could get rough. That's when supplies were lowest and the hunger got real. People watered down soup, skipped meals, or ate things they normally wouldn't touch: grass, bark, mushrooms of questionable origin. It happened. This is what historians call the hungry gap. And for the poor, it was the scariest part of the year. Not delicious, but it worked. Winter meals in Dark Age Britain weren't tasty. They weren't exciting. They were practical, plain, and meant to keep you alive. And they did keep people alive. Just enough to plant crops in spring and do it all again. So the next time you microwave leftovers and complain they're boring, just remember, at least you're not chewing on your fourth turnip of the week while your neighbor's goat stares at you through the window. Winter fun, celebrations, and the rare day off. All right. So, we've talked about the cold, the mud, the terrible food, and the endless chores. It might seem like winter in Dark Age Britain was all doom and gloom, but guess what? Even in the darkest months of the year, people still found time to relax, celebrate, and, believe it or not, have a little fun. Not a lot, mind you, but enough to stay sane. Holy days equals holidays. Let's start with church festivals. The early, medieval church basically ran the calendar, and winter was sprinkled with religious feast days, and when the church threw a feast, it wasn't all fasting and chanting. It was a big deal. Think of it like this. If normal life was a turnip stew, feast days were the rare splash of bacon grease on top. Some of the big winter holy days included Christmas Christ's Mass, celebrated by the early medieval church, starting around the 5th or 6th century, though it was more spiritual than sparkly. No trees or stockings, but maybe extra bread and ale. Epiphany January 6th, marking the visit of the wise men, with prayers and possibly another shared meal. Candlemas February 2nd, celebrating light returning to the world, fitting for people who hadn't seen the sun in weeks. On feast days, you could take a break from work. There might be singing, prayers, storytelling, and a slightly less awful stew. You might even wear your nice tunic, you know, the one without too many holes. Story time by the fire with long, dark nights and nothing much to do after sunset. Storytelling was one of the best forms of entertainment. People would gather around the hearth, wrapped in cloaks, listening to tales of brave warriors, trickster foxes, saints, and ancient kings. Some stories were passed down from Celtic or Anglo-Saxon traditions, full of magic, monsters, and dramatic speeches. Others were just gossip about your weird neighbor and that time his cow escaped during church. Some folks could sing or recite poems, especially if they were a bard or a traveling guest. No Netflix, but a good bard could hold a crowd's attention just fine. And if the fire was warm and the ale was flowing, the stories got longer and weirder. Games, low tech, high spirits. No PlayStations here, but medieval folks weren't entirely. JOYLESS. Winter games were simple but fun. You had knuckle bones, like dice, but made from animal bones. Roll them, toss them, gamble with them. Board games. Some early versions of checkers or Hnefataf, a Viking strategy game, might have made their way into Britain by the later Dark Ages. Wrestling or rough play indoors, parents not amused. Guessing games or riddles, which were surprisingly popular. And for the rowdy types, there was always indoor tag, also known as running and yelling until something breaks. Singing and music. If someone had a harp, flute, or horn, they were the life of the village. Singing was a big deal, whether it was church chants, work songs, or thus someone belting out a song about a goat falling in a ditch. Music lifted the mood. Clapping, stomping, and banging things together were all perfectly acceptable instruments, especially after a cup or two of ale. You didn't need to be good, you just needed to be loud. Animal-based entertainment. Really, animals were part of the household, and sometimes they became unwilling entertainers. Imagine this: it's been snowing for 2 weeks. You're trapped indoors with your siblings. Someone baits you can't get the chicken to walk across the table without falling off. Suddenly, it's chicken race night. Pigs, dogs, goats, all occasionally became part of games. Not always kind, not always clean, but definitely something to do. And if you had a cat, you just watched it chase shadows and judged your own life choices. Winter weddings and feasts. Winter wasn't the most practical time to get married, but it did happen. Why? Because everyone was home. And a wedding meant a big meal, a fire, and something to look forward to. Food might have been rationed for weeks in advance just to make it happen. A pig was slaughtered. Barley ale was brewed. Everyone danced until their boots fell apart. And then, when it was over, life went right back to mud and chores, but with a little more gossip to keep things spicy. Festivals from the old days before Christianity took over the calendar. Pagan festivals ruled the seasonal wheel, even in early medieval times. Some of these older traditions stuck around, especially in rural areas. Yule or Midwinter, a pre-Christian winter solstice festival, which likely involved feasting, firelight, and welcoming the return of longer days. Imbolc early February, a Celtic festival marking the first signs of spring, associated with fertility, lambing season, and the goddess Brigid, later Saint Brigid, By the Dark Ages, a lot of these pagan festivals had been Christianized, but the spirit of celebration, the joy of surviving another cold, dark month, still lingered. Fun. Jobs that were almost gamesake. This one's a stretch, but sometimes, just getting out of the house felt like a treat. Fetching wood, checking traps, feeding animals, they were all chores, but they were also a chance to move, breathe fresh air, and not be inside with 6 people breathing loudly. Plus, if you were a kid, every task was a chance to pretend you were hunting a bear or escaping Saxon raiders. Imagination. The medieval kid's only toy, the best part, doing nothing innocently. The ultimate winter fun might have been just sitting. After a hard day, you curl up by the fire, wrapped in every tunic you own, sipping a mug of thin ale, and listening to the wind rattle the roof. You survived another day. Your fingers are still attached. Your stew didn't kill anyone. Sometimes, that's enough. Staying healthy or just staying alive. Let's be real. Surviving winter in Dark Age Britain was already hard enough. But now let's throw in another delightful challenge, not getting sick. Which, as it turns out, was almost impossible. Between the cold, the damp, the bad food, and the fact that everyone was basically living in a smoky wooden box with livestock, germs were having the time of their lives. Forget modern colds and flu. Winter sickness back then was serious business. First, the obvious problems. Let's say you're a perfectly average Dark Age Briton. What could possibly go wrong during a normal winter? Coughing. Oh yeah. The air inside your house is full of smoke from the fire that never stops burning. No chimney. No ventilation. Just smoke and lungs. It's like camping forever, but less fun. Frostbite, very possible. Mittens weren't exactly trending yet, and if your shoes had holes, your toes were toast. Literally, frozen toast. Malnutrition, big one. If your harvest wasn't great or rats got into the grain stores, you might spend the winter living off turnip peels and regret. And all of that's before the actual diseases show up. The winter sickness paradoner was prime time for illness. Everyone was crowded indoors. Hygiene wasn't amazing. Spoiler, it was bad, and there was no such thing as antibiotics. Here are just a few of the charming ailments making the rounds. Winter fever, likely a mix of flu, pneumonia, or bronchitis. If you couldn't shake the cough, you were in real trouble. Dysentery. Remember, there's no plumbing. People got sick from contaminated water and dirty hands. Scurvy. No fresh veggies or fruits all winter meant vitamin C was basically a myth. Gums bled. Teeth fell out. People groaned a lot. And no, there weren't hospitals. If you got sick, your options were 1. Lie down, 2. Drink a weird potion, and 3. Hope. So, what did they do about it? Well, people had a few strategies. None of them particularly scientific, but hey, they tried. 1. Herbs, roots, and Hope's Dark Age medicine was a wild mix of old folk knowledge, pagan traditions, and early Christian influence. If you were sick, someone might brew you a tea from sage, yarrow, or nettles. Rub onion on your chest, recite a charm or prayer while waving a burning stick. Shove garlic up your nose. Not a joke. They thought it helped with colds. Honestly, some herbs did have real effects, but it was mostly trial and error, with a lot of error. 2. Leeches. If you were fancy, leeches weren't super common among regular folk, but in some areas, bleeding was seen as a way to balance the body. Too much phlegm. Time to let some blood out. Feeling sluggish. Bleed again. Got a rash. More blood. It was all based on the idea of humors, that your body was made up of different fluids that needed to stay in balance. It wasn't true, but people believed it for centuries. 3. The power of prayer. When your neighbor's coughing up blood and your child has a strange rash, sometimes you just pray. Monks, priests, and holy women were often called on to bless the sick, offer relics, or say mass for healing. Some people even believed certain saints could protect against certain illnesses. Saint Sebastian was big for the plague. So you'd light a candle, whisper a prayer, and hope the saint was listening. Prevention, kind of, to avoid getting sick. In the first place, some families tried their best to keep things clean, in a medieval kind of way. Ashes and soapwort were used to wash hands and clothes. Floors were swept with bundles of sticks. Hands were rinsed before meals sometimes. Chamber pots were emptied somewhere outside, hopefully not too close to the well, and then there were the charms. People hung herbs in doorways, carved symbols into beams, or wore amulets to keep away evil spirits, because if it wasn't bad air or cold that made you sick, it must have been demons, right? The village healer of every village had at least one wise person, a woman or sometimes man who knew a thing or two about plants, poultices, and old remedies. They might be a midwife, a bone setter, or thus someone who had lived long enough to know that nettle tea helped with joint pain. They were respected and feared. Because in some places, being too good at healing got you accused of witchcraft. And that never ended well. Death was common. Let's not sugarcoat it. People died in winter, especially the old, the young, and the already weak. If you made it through to spring, it was kind of a miracle. A lot of prayers were said, a lot of burials happened, and the cold, silent mornings were a little heavier because of it. But people still kept going, because they had to. But not everyone was doomed. Weirdly enough, some folks did stay relatively healthy. Why? Maybe they had good genes. Maybe their home was better built, fewer drafts, better fire. Maybe they had access to more food or cleaner water. Or B, they just got really lucky. The Dark Ages weren't constant disaster. People adapted. They learned what herbs helped with what. They built stronger walls. They passed on stories about which foods kept you going and which mushrooms. Definitely did and single quotes T. And somehow, they survived the idea that anyone lived through a medieval winter without vitamin C, penicillin, or a single pair of socks is kind of amazing. But they did it. Through stubbornness, through tradition, through a lot of sitting very still under a blanket of hay, whispering, don't cough, don't cough. They found ways to treat illness, even without understanding germs or viruses. They leaned on community, belief, and a little bit of magic, monsters, spirits, and winter superstitions. So, you're stuck inside your tiny wooden hut, the wind howling outside, your candle flickering, and your grandpa suddenly says, don't whistle after dark, the spirits are listening. Okay. Thanks, Grandpa. Welcome to the wonderful world of Dark Age winter superstitions, where long nights and cold weather weren't just uncomfortable, they were terrifying. Why winter was the creepiest seasoning the Dark Ages, people didn't fully understand how the world worked. Why it got cold, why people got sick, why weird sounds came from the forest at night. So they made sense of it the best way they could, magic and monsters, and winter. Oh, it was peak monster season, long nights, frozen forests, eerie silence. It's no wonder people started seeing things, ghosts, ghouls, and grandma's warnings. Let's start with ghosts, or restless spirits. Winter was a time of death. People passed away from sickness or hunger, and sometimes their spirits were believed to stick around. If someone hadn't had a proper burial or died with unfinished business, they might wander. You'd hear creaking in the rafters, definitely, not just the wind, and someone would whisper, it's old Tom, back for his boots. To protect yourself, people might burn juniper or herbs by the door, leave out bread for passing spirits, avoid certain places at night, especially crossroads, wells, and barns. Totally normal stuff. Don't step outside after dark. The forest in winter was already scary. Add in some supernatural flair, and you've got night creatures. Some believed in shadowy figures that prowled the woods after sunset, not quite human, not quite beast. If you wandered too far, you might never come back. Best case, you get lost. Worst case, something finds you. And then there was the wild hunt, a ghostly procession led by a dark rider or even a godlike figure, charging through the skies during stormy nights. Dogs barking, wind howling. That wasn't weather, that was them, galloping across the heavens. If you heard it, you stayed inside. If you saw it, you might be next. Household rules with a spooky twist. Some winter customs were just about manners. They were survival tactics wrapped in superstition. Don't sweep after dark. You might sweep away good luck. Or stir up bad spirits hiding in the corners. No spinning yarn on holy days, or the fairies might curse your thread. Leave some food out overnight, in case the ancestors are visiting. People didn't always believe these things literally, but hey, better safe than sorry. Fairies, not the cute kin fairies in Dark Age Britain, weren't sparkly little winged creatures. They were wild, unpredictable, and sometimes downright dangerous. Winter was a time they were most active, slipping through cracks, messing with animals, stealing food, or luring people into the woods to keep them away. Folks might hang iron over doorways, tie rowan branches to their fences, whistle, but only during the day. And if something strange happened, milk went sour, chickens vanished, or someone got sick overnight, guess who got blamed? Fairies. Every time. Shapeshifters and other forests were dosed. Winter was also the season of shapeshifters, creatures that looked human but weren't. Some stories told of skin changers, people who could turn into wolves or bears. Others whispered about bog spirits that lived near frozen rivers, waiting to grab the ankles of anyone foolish enough to get close. It wasn't all bad though. A few spirits were thought to protect homes, like household brownies, or helpful ghosts who'd tidy up if you left out a bowl of porridge. Honestly, who wouldn't trade a bowl of porridge for a clean floor? Dreams and omens. Winter dreams weren't just dreams. They were seen as messages. If you dreamed of fire, it might mean warmth or passion. Or maybe someone was going to die. Interpretations varied a lot. Birds behaving strangely. That was a sign. A dog howling at night. Definitely death coming. A candle going out by itself. Yikes. People read signs into everything, especially in winter. You're stuck inside. Everything's gloomy. Your brain starts finding meaning in the smallest things. Church meets folklore as Christianity spread. The church tried to tone things down. They told people not to believe in fairies, ghosts, or the wild hunt. But let's be honest, a lot of folks still did. So the church did the next best thing. They absorbed the superstitions. Some spirits became demons, others were explained as fallen angels, and old pagan festivals were turned into Christian ones. Samhain became All Saints' Day, Midwinter Solstice. Hello, Christmas. It was easier to keep the tradition going if you just rebranded it a little. Huddled around the fire, telling tale. Storytelling was the ultimate winter entertainment. No books, no phones, no Netflix, just you, your family, a smoky fire, and your cousin dramatically describing a haunted barn he definitely saw last week. Tales got passed down, some funny, some frightening, some complete nonsense, but all of them served a purpose: to explain the unexplainable, to teach a lesson, or just to kill time before bed. And if someone added a creepy detail that made everyone glance nervously at the window, even better. Did they really believe it? That's the big question. Did people truly believe in spirits and monsters? Some probably did. Others maybe just followed the customs because their parents did. And some just liked having an excuse to light candles and not sweep the floor. But one thing is clear. These beliefs shaped how people thought, how they behaved, and how they survived the cold, scary, unknown months of winter. Because when the world is dark and dangerous, a good ghost story helps. Winter entertainment, music, stories, and mild drunkenness. So, you survived another freezing Dark Age day. You've chopped wood, fed the goats, eaten some sad turnips. And now it's pitch black outside. Again, what's a Briton to do? Well, Time to light the fire, pull your cloak tight, and enjoy some very low-tech entertainment. Winter might have been tough, but it wasn't all doom and gloom. In fact, the long nights were perfect for stories, songs, and just the right amount of mead-fueled chaos. Gather round the fire in the dark ages. The fire wasn't just for warmth, it was the center of everything. Cooking. Fire, light, fire, keeping spirits away. Also fire. But in the evenings, it became your very own stage. Everyone, kids, elders, neighbors, would gather around and swap tales. No radio, no podcasts, just mouths, ears, and memories. And if someone had a lute or a harp, even better. Time for some music. The bard, MVP of winter nights. Every village needed at least one person who could spin a good story or bust out a tune. These were the bards, shops, or gleemen, depending on where and when you were. Basically, they were walking libraries mixed with folk singers. They told tales of ancient kings, bloody battles, heroes, and monsters. Slightly exaggerated family legends. They were like human Netflix, only with way more facial hair. Favorite winter story. Espel loved epic tales. The bigger and weirder, the better. Stories of Beowulf fighting swamp monsters. Yes, ghosts that haunted frozen forests. Absolutely. Giants, dragons, talking animals, of course. That's peak winter content. But not everything was spooky. There were also funny stories, love stories, and wise old fables with some sort of moral, like, don't steal your neighbor's bread or a fox will eat your soul, or something like that. Games? Yes, but very low-tech with no Monopoly or insight. Winter games were all about what you could play indoors. Some options included riddles, the more confusing, the better. Dice games, using carved bone, dice story games, like Tell a Tale, Pass It on mock trials. Yes, they sometimes pretended to be judges and argued over who stole the cheese if you had a spare pig bladder. You might even kick it around like a football, indoors, hopefully not near the fire. Drinking, a toast to getting through. Eat a yes, the mead, sweet, boozy, and basically ancient beer made from honey. Winter was peak drinking season. It warmed the belly and loosened tongues, which made the stories funnier, the songs louder, and the arguments dumber. Important note, they didn't drink just to get blitzed. Well, sometimes they did, but alcohol was also safer than water in many places. Plus, a cup of something warm helped take the chill off, and every village had at least one guy who thought he could sing once he'd had a few mugs. Spoiler, he couldn't. Celebrations and feasts. Winter wasn't all hunger and gloom. There were a few bright spots on the calendar where people really pulled out all the stops. The biggest midwinter festivals, often right around the solstice, long before Christmas became a thing. People already had celebrations for the return of the sun. These included big fires, feasting on whatever food wouldn't last till spring, singing and dancing, sacrifices or offerings, sometimes goats, sometimes bread. Later, as Christianity spread, these became more like Christmas feasts, still, with meat, ale, and noisy cousins, cozy nights, cold feet. Not every night was a party, of course. Some nights were quiet. You just sit by the fire, sew or repair tools, maybe hum a tune while stirring the stew. Someone might carve a spoon or whittle a stick into something decorative. You'd listen to the wind batter the walls and be grateful you weren't outside. And even when the wind howled and your feet were blocks of ice, it was a little easier knowing you weren't going through it alone. The kids had fun. 2 children weren't just little workers, though yes, they helped with chores. But in the evenings, they'd get to play, games like tag around the hearth, watch the fire, shadow puppets making up silly songs, playing guess what I just found in the thatch. Answers ranged from bugs to small frogs. Winter could be boring, but kids found ways to have fun, especially when snow was around. Snowballs, sledding on planks, or just lying in the snow like weird little frozen starfish, one eye on the door. Even during all this fun, There was always a little edge of caution, a weird sound outside. Everyone goes silent. A draft from the roof. Better check for spirits. Someone sneezes 3 times in a row. Definitely cursed. That's just how it was. Laughter and fear lived side by side. You told stories to pass time, but also to keep the shadows at bay. Wyatt mattered entertain in winter and just for fun. It kept people sane. When the world outside felt dead and frozen, stories reminded you that life goes on. Songs helped you remember the past. Games kept kids distracted from hunger. Laughter warmed more than just the room. It kept your heart going, because surviving winter wasn't just about food and fire. It was about staying human, and that meant telling stories, dancing badly, and arguing about whose turn it was to tend the stew. The church and the winter calendar *. So, it's the middle of another freezing winter in Dark Age Britain. You're cold, you're hungry, you've heard the same 3 songs for 6 weeks straight, and you have absolutely no idea what day it is. But someone does. The church. Yep. While most villagers are just trying to stay alive, the local church has a schedule, a calendar, a full spiritual itinerary with feast days, fast days, and just enough holy guilt to keep things spicy. Time, according to God back then, people didn't live by months and Mondays like we do. Time was measured by the church's calendar, a rhythm of saint days, festivals, and holy seasons. It wasn't just about religion. These events were how folks kept track of time. If someone said, "Remember that snowstorm after St. Cuthbert's Day," everyone knew what they meant. It was like, oh yeah, February-ish. That's when Walter fell into the frozen pond. Winter was holy season. Winter was packed with religious days. Why? Because when life was cold and miserable, people turned to the church for comfort, structure, and hope. And also, let's be real, a bit of socializing. Some major winter highlights: Advent, the lead up to Christmas, a time of fasting and preparing your soul and your pantry. Christmas or Christ's Mass, a proper feast day. Yes, even peasants got excited. Epiphany, January 6th, celebrating the visit of the wise men. More singing, maybe cake if you were lucky. Candlemas, February 2nd, technically the end of winter in the religious calendar. Spoiler, it was still very cold. Fasting, because turnips weren't miserable enough. Church didn't just throw feasts. It also gave you fasting days, lots of them, and in winter, that meant something like this: hey, your food stores are already low, right? Great. Now skip meat today, and tomorrow, and next week. Good luck. Wednesdays, Fridays, and certain whole weeks were no meat zones. Sometimes even dairy and eggs were banned, just fish, vegetables, and grumbling. But people didn't fast because they were super devout 24/7s. It was a mix of faith, habit, and survival. Honestly, the church rules kind of fit with the whole we're out of pork situation. Feast days, the light at the end of the turnip tunnel. But don't worry, the church knew you needed something to look forward to. Feast days were sprinkled throughout winter like little golden tickets. On these days, the fasting ended, the meat came out, and the mood lifted. Sometimes it was roast goose. Other times, just extra bread and a stronger drink. But psychologically, it was everything. Imagine weeks of bland cabbage soup. And then, bam, feast day. Your soul sings, your stomach thanks you. Feast days also meant music, dancing, and maybe a priest trying to join in and instantly regretting it. Saints kept you companion. Every day of the year was connected to some saint. Winter had its own lineup of spiritual celebrities. St. Nicholas, December 6th. Yep, the OG Santa, patron of children, sailors, and pawnbrokers. Quite the resume. St. Stephen, December 26th, a day for giving to the poor. Also for mild hangovers after Christmas. St. Bridget, February 1st, a mix of Christian, saint and older goddess traditions. She brought a little warmth back into the frozen world. These saints gave people something to talk about, something to pray to, and something to hang hope on when things felt bleak. Monks had it rough and holy if you were a monk in winter. Life was even more intense. You weren't just surviving. You were praying constantly, sleeping little, and waking up before dawn to chant psalms in a stone chapel that felt like a freezer. But monks believed that hardship brought them closer to God. Cold fingers, holy suffering, empty stomach, spiritual strength. And while the average villager wasn't living like that, they still admired the monks for being hardcore. Or at least respected them enough to not steal their chickens, processions, and candle samites. Winter brought special ceremonies to break up the gloom. One example, Candlemas in early February. People brought candles to church to be blessed. Then they walked around with them in a kind of candle-powered parade. It was cozy and a little spooky. Candles symbolized light in darkness, both literally and spiritually. And when the sun sets at 4 p.m. and your walls are made of sticks, that kind of symbolism hits hard. Church bells and quiet comfort even for folks who weren't super religious. The church was part of life. The bells rang out across the snow, the priest gave familiar sermons in a language you half understood. The rituals were comforting, even when you didn't get all the details. And honestly, in the bleak midwinter, having some kind of schedule, even one made of fasts and prayers, was better than nothing. It gave people something to do, a reason to keep going, a reason to gather and be together. The church's secret power, hope eyes. The church controlled behavior, made rules, and collected tithes. But in winter, its biggest gift was hope. Hope that spring would come, that the saints were watching, that suffering had meaning. The winter calendar reminded people that the cold was part of a cycle, and that warmth, light, and renewal were on the way, even if it still felt like your toes were permanently frozen. Clothing that barely worked. So, it's winter in Dark Age Britain. The wind is howling. Your hut is basically a glorified mud pie. You're cold, tired, and hoping your clothes will save you from turning into a peasant-shaped icicle. Spoiler, they won't, because while Dark Age folks did their best, medieval fashion wasn't exactly built for blizzards. It was scratchy, soggy, and full of holes. And don't even ask about underwear. Let's break down the wardrobe of a chilly Briton. The wool life main ingredient in your winter outfit. Wool. Wool was everywhere. Shirts, cloaks, hats, even socks if you were lucky. It was scratchy and kind of smelled like the sheep it came from. But it was warmish, and that's all that mattered. People spun wool at home, dyed it with natural stuff like plants or, yes, urine, and stitched it into simple clothing. Did it repel water? Not really. Did it keep you warm when wet? Sort of. Did it make you itchy in places you didn't know you had? Absolutely. But it was your best bet against the cold. Layers were life. Winter dressing was all about layers. Under tunic, a basic wool shirt over tunic, a thicker shirt on top cloak, your portable blanket leg bindings, basically woolen wraps to keep your calves from freezing off. There were no zippers, no elastic, no cozy fleece lining. You tied things with bits of rope or leather. If it stayed on and kept the wind out, it was fashion. And yes, people did wear multiple tunics when it got really cold. Looking like a walking laundry pile was a small price to pay for warmth. Cloaks. Your winter blanket cloak was essential. It was your jacket, coat, poncho, and blanket all rolled into one. Cloaks were usually fastened with a brooch or a wooden pin at the shoulder. Some had hoods, others didn't, and some cloaks were made of animal skins. Fur side in. If you had a cloak with real fur on it, you were either a noble or lucky enough to trap something furry before it ran away. Cloaks were especially important because Dark Age homes weren't exactly toasty. You didn't take your cloak off when you got indoors. You just sat down in it like a sad, wool-covered potato. Shoes. Kind of. Let's talk about footwear, or the lack of it. Most people wore simple leather shoes made from a single piece of hide, wrapped and tied around the foot. Think of it like a leather tortilla for your toes. No solace, no insulation, just a barrier between your skin and the mud. Socks existed, but they were rare. If you had them, they were wool. If you didn't, you shoved straw or moss in your shoes and hoped for the best. Feet were often cold, wet, and unhappy. Trench foot was probably just called Tuesday, gloves and hats gloves. Sometimes, they were usually mittens made of wool or leather. Not stylish, just warm, sort of. Hats, on the other hand, were actually pretty common. People knew that covering your head helped keep you warm. They were simple caps made of wool or fur. If you had long hair, you kept it under a cap or hood, not for fashion, but because wind loves a good scalp. Underwear, or lack thereof. So, did they wear underwear? Sort of. Men might wear something like loose shorts called bries, made from linen. Women sometimes wore a linen shift under their tunics. But in winter, these were cold, thin, and not really up to the job. And remember, laundry was hard. You couldn't just toss your undies in the wash every day, so they were worn, reworn, and probably very crunchy by February. Rich people dressed warmer and fancier as always. If you had money, you dressed better. The upper classes had thicker wool, lined cloaks, and more layers. They also had access to imported materials like silk or fine linen, which were totally useless in winter but made you look important. Some nobles had clothes dyed deep blue, red, or green, colors that meant you had wealth, or at least friends with plants. And the really rich, they had fur trim, like rabbit, fox, or even squirrel. Fashionable and functional. Children were just small adult kids. Didn't have cute puffy jackets or tiny snow boots. They wore the same stuff as adults, just smaller. If you were a child in winter, your outfit was one itchy tunic, one heavy cloak, wet feet, snot frozen on your face, and yet kids ran around like little maniacs anyway. Resilient, filthy, and loud, just as nature intended. No washing, no drying. Here's the thing. If your wool clothes got wet, you couldn't just dry them by the fire. They might shrink, or catch on fire, or both. So you had to hang them near the smoke, where they'd get warmish and absorb the smell of whatever animal was roasting that day. You didn't wash wool often, because soap was rare, water was freezing, and scrubbing ruined the fabric. So clothes weren't exactly fresh. By March, they had their own personality. Winter was a whole vibe. Dark Age winter fashion wasn't about looking good. It was about not dying. Your outfit kept your skin mostly covered, made you itch, smelled weird, and made you look like a bundle of lawn. When the wind blew hard and the nights got long, you were grateful for every lumpy, damp, oddly shaped piece of it, because even if it barely worked, it worked just enough. Winter sickness, coughs, and cures. So, you've made it through a few weeks of Dark Age winter. You're tired. You're cold. Your feet haven't been dry since October. And now, of course, you're sick. Your throat's on fire. Your nose is leaking like a broken thatch roof. And your neighbor thus sneezed directly into your oat bowl. Welcome to medieval cold and flu season. Winter was tough already. But getting sick during it, that was a whole new level of suffering. Because Dark Age medicine was a strange mix of herbal remedies, trial and error, and just plain luck. Let's take a closer but not too close look. Germs. Never heard of them. People in the Dark Ages didn't know about germs. Microscopes didn't exist yet. So, when someone got sick, they didn't think, ah yes, a virus. They thought things like, you've got too much phlegm in your body, the spirits are angry, you are cursed, or simply, that's just what happens in February. Instead of modern science, medicine back then was based on ancient ideas, especially the theory of the four humors. You had blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile sloshing around in you. If they got out of balance, boom, you were ill. Sound silly? Maybe, but it was their best guess. The local healer, or wise person, if you were feeling terrible, You didn't call a doctor, you called the local wise woman, or, in some cases, a monk with a medical scroll. These folks knew how to make herbal remedies, poultices, and teas. They'd seen a lot of fevers, rashes, and weird lumps in their time. Their medicine cabinet included honey for sore throats, garlic for infections, nettle for joint pain, onion for basically everything, and sometimes dried toad bits. Let's not talk about it. Were these cures effective? Sometimes. Was it better than nothing? Usually. Herbal brews and smelly stews. Most people didn't have access to rare medicine, but what they did have were plants, and a lot of hope. Here's what a typical cure might look like in winter. You've got a cough. Boil some sage in water, add a spoon of honey, and drink it while praying to Saint Coffus, not a real saint. You're feverish. Try lying in bed with a cloth soaked in vinegar and rose water on your head. Got the chills? That's easy. More onions. Honestly, onions were the go-to solution for everything. You ate them, drank them, rubbed them on wounds, and probably whispered your secrets to them when things got serious. But what if it wasn't just a cough? What if it was something worse, like a bad fever, a festering wound, or, worst of all, the winter stomach plague, aka food poisoning from that weird old meat you ate last week? Well, then it got scary. There were no hospitals, no emergency rooms, no antibiotics. If you were lucky, you might be taken to a monastery where monks knew a little Latin and had a dusty book about herbs. But often, you just lay in bed and hoped. People used charms, prayer, chants, and sometimes, if things looked really grim, bloodletting. Yes, they'd cut you open a little and let some blood out. Why? To balance your humors? Of course. Does it work? Not even slightly? Colds that just wouldn't quit. Winter colds in the Dark Ages dragged on for weeks. There was no NyQuil, no cough drops, no tissues. Just a wool sleeve, a loud sneeze, and an apologetic shrug. And if you lived in a house with 10 people, a goat, and a smoky fire, everyone got it. The whole hut would turn into one giant, sniffling chorus of misery, but they powered through. Hot broth, thick cloaks, and whatever herbs they had. That was the routine. No one expected to feel great in winter. Slightly less terrible was the goal. Toothaches, burns, and broken stuff. Sickness wasn't the only problem. Winter also brought toothaches, made worse by cold air, burns from fireside accidents, frostbite, especially on fingers and toes, slips and falls. Thanks to icy paths and bad shoes, there were no dentists. If your tooth hurt too much, someone yanked it out with pliers. Or maybe a rock. If you burned yourself, they might smear honey or lard on it. Broken bones, wooden splints, and a lot of lying down. It wasn't pretty, but it was the best they had. The healing power of sleep and soup. Even with all the strange treatments, people in the Dark Ages knew that rest and food helped. If you were sick, you stayed by the fire, drank warm broth, and tried to nap. If the coughing goats let you, families looked after each other. Neighbors shared herbs. Kids were told to stop poking the sick person with sticks. Recovery was slow. But if you made it through the illness, it was cause for celebration, even if that just meant adding extra garlic to your next meal. Death was always near Bennett to bring the mood down. But yeah, people died. Even a small infection could be deadly. A bad fever, untreated wound, or mysterious winter cough might take someone out within days. That's why people were so serious about saints, charms, and prayers. You never knew what might help, and you didn't want to take any chances. But despite the risk, life went on, because it had to. A stronger kind of tough people in the Dark Ages didn't expect comfort. They didn't wait for modern cures that didn't exist. They just endured. Their medicine was basic. Their food was bland. Their socks were made of moss. But they kept going. And if they could survive a medieval winter flu with nothing but onion tea and a fur cloak, you can probably handle your Monday meeting, the longest nights, and the fire that never went out. So, It's pitch black outside. The wind is howling through the cracks in your hut walls. You're wrapped in every animal skin you own. Someone's snoring. Someone else is coughing. Your only light. The flicker of the fire in the center of the room. Welcome to a dark age winter night. And when we say night, we're not talking about a cute little 7 p.m. to 6 a.m. situation. Nope. We single quotes re-talking 15 to 16 hours of darkness. Every single day. Let's talk about how people got through the longest, coldest nights, and why the fire in the middle of the house wasn't just for warmth. It was everything. Darker than dark in winter. The sun barely showed its face. If you were living in Britain in, say, the 9th century, daylight might last only about 8 hours. The rest, just cold, damp darkness. No street lights. No flashlights. No let's check my phone real quick. Once the fire burned low, that was it. Just shadows, breathing, and the occasional creak of wind or something else, probably a fox, hopefully a fox. The night could feel endless. Fire. The life savereth at fire in the middle of your home. It was sacred. It gave you heat. So you didn't freeze light. So you didn't stub your toe on a goat. Protection from wild animals and evil spirits. They didn't like fire company, because people gathered around it. And here's the key thing. It couldn't go out. Ever. If the fire died during the night, the cold would creep in, and starting a new fire from scratch wasn't easy. You didn't have matches or a lighter. You had flint, steel, and sore fingers. So someone always kept watch, even while others snored under their cloaks. One person, usually the one who drew the short straw, stayed awake to feed the flames. What did people do all night? Good question. You can only stare into the fire for so long. Here's what might happen during one of those lone winter nights. 1. Story time. This was prime time for legends, folktales, and scary ghost stories. Elders would spin tales about ancient warriors, fairies in the woods, ghosts who visited in snowstorms, saints who wrestled the months. Even the same stories were told over and over. It passed the time and made the darkness feel less heavy. 2. Crafts and repairs. While the fire burned, folks might mend clothes, sharpen knives, patch up shoes, twist wool into thread. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept hands busy and minds occupied. 3. Whispers and schemes. With nothing else to do, people talked about what to plant in spring, who might be cursed that weird noise in the woods last night, or who had been acting strangely since the last full moon. Winter nights were perfect for gossip and suspicion. Sleeping, but not like us. Here's something strange. People didn't sleep in one big chunk. Instead, they often had first sleep, second sleep. After dinner, people would go to bed early, say around 7 or 8 p.m. They'd sleep for a few hours, then wake up around midnight. For an hour or two, they'd be awake, praying, talking quietly, or stoking the fire. Then they'd go back to sleep until dawn. This split sleep pattern wasn't weird back then. It was normal. The long nights naturally broke rest into pieces. Honestly, kind of makes you feel better about waking up at 3 a.m. for no reason. Winter fears and night creatures. Night wasn't just cold, it was scary. People believed the darkness was full of witches, ghosts, evil spirits, and other creepy things that lurked outside the firelight. If you heard a sound outside, you didn't open the door. You prayed, maybe whispered a charm, maybe clutched a dried herb pouch for protection. Some even believed that the dead wander during the darkest nights, especially in midwinter, when the boundary between the worlds was thinnest. Cheery, right? Hearth equals hearth. Word hearth literally means the floor of the fireplace, but in Dark Age Britain, it meant home, families, neighbors, even livestock. They all gathered around the same fire, ate around it, slept near it, shared their warmth and their stories. The fire was more than wood and flame. It was community, memory, survival. If you lost your hearth, you lost your place in the world. Special fires. Special nitrotain. Winter nights had ritual fires or customs. For example, Yule, The ancient midwinter festival involved lighting special logs to ward off darkness. In Christian times, Christmas Eve might be celebrated with extra candles and songs. Some regions believed in keeping the fire burning bright to welcome good spirits. Either way, fire was part of the spiritual battle against the long, icy night. Candle light and oil lamps. Not for most people. Candles were expensive. Oil lamps weren't common in every hut. If you were poor, which, let's be real, you probably were, your only light was the main fire, and maybe a small torch if you needed to step outside and risk frostbite or werewolf attack. Just kidding. Probably. Silence and stillness. The fire crackled low. People would drift off, bundled together, wrapped in animal hides, pressed close to share heat. The world outside was silent, still, frozen. No cars, no buzzing street lamps, no hum of electronics. Just the occasional owl, the rustle of trees, the sound of your own breath in the cold. It was quiet, it was simple. It was deep winter. And somehow, people found peace in it. Just keep the fire going. That was the unspoken rule of every dark age winter night. Just keep the fire going. Feed it. Watch it. Don't let it die, because as long as there was fire, there was hope. There was life, there was tomorrow. And when the sun finally returned, a little longer each day, the fire had done its job. When spring finally came, and how they celebrated not dying. You've made it. After months of cold toes, cabbage soup, and questionable animal noises in the dark, spring has finally arrived in Dark Age Britain. Birds are chirping, the mud is slightly less frozen, and the sun, it's showing up before noon again. Time to celebrate the best thing that could possibly happen to a Dark Age Britain, not dying during winter. Let's talk about what spring meant to them, and how they celebrated survival like it was a full-time job. The first signs of life. Spring didn't arrive with a big ta-da. No flowers blooming overnight. No magical sunbeams. Instead, it crept in slowly. Snow melted into slush, and muck streams started to flow again. Birds returned and made a racket in the trees. Buds appeared on bare branches like tiny green promises. And, if you were lucky, your goat started looking pregnant. People notice everything. After months of gray skies and empty fields, even a patch of grass was exciting. Like, bring out the drums level exciting. A deep breath. And some serious clean Newfin. The days got longer. People finally had enough daylight to do stuff again. First order of business. Fix everything. The roof leaking, the fence fallen over, the floor one big mud pit. The house looked like it had been attacked by wolves and wind, which, honestly, it probably had. So spring meant rethatching the roof, cleaning out ash piles, and soot, repairing fences and tools, letting fresh air back into the house, which probably smelled like smoked turnips and feet. Basically, spring cleaning, but way more vital. Food. Glorious food. Eventually winter food was mostly dried, pickled, or just sad. Spring didn't instantly fill your table with bounty, but it gave you hope. You'd start seeing fresh greens like nettles, sorrel, and wild garlic, early vegetables like leeks and onions, eggs. Now that chickens were laying again, milk from animals that had given birth. The stuff tasted amazing after 5 months of root vegetables and regrets. And the best part, it wasn't just food, it was a sign of life returning. Farming mode activated the minute the soil was soft enough to poke. It was go time. Spring meant plowing the fields. If you had oxen, great. If not, time to push sowing barley, oats, rye, and beans, planting gardens with onions, garlic, peas, and herbs, and praying the weather didn't betray you again. Planting season was both hopeful and terrifying. One bad storm or dry spell could ruin everything. But you had to try, because this was how you survived next winter. Spiritual springtime people didn't just feel it in their bodies, they felt it in their souls. Spring was holy, sacred, magical. In pre-Christian times, this was when folks honored nature gods and goddesses. Easter, The Anglo-Saxon spring goddess, yes. Possibly the inspiration for Easter spirits of the land and fields fertility gods, because babies human and animal equals survivalin after Christianity spread. Spring remained full of sacred meaning. Easter became the centerpiece of the season. It symbolized rebirth, both spiritual and natural, and it often coincided with lambing season, which was convenient. Basically, whether pagan or Christian, people looked at spring and saw renewal, celebrations and feasts. You know what happens when you survive another winter? You party. Even if there wasn't much food yet, communities found ways to celebrate. Small spring feasts with whatever they had: eggs, milk, early greens, dancing, often in circles, easy choreography, low risk of injury, singing old songs about the earth, waking up, lighting bonfires to drive away lingering winter spirits, and if someone had brewed beer during the winter, even better. May Day madness. One of the biggest springtime celebrations came in early May. We're talking May Day. Baby. It had everything: flowers, gathered at dawn and worn as crowns, maypoles, where people danced around ribbons like caffeinated squirrels, Morris dancing, which involved bells, sticks, and a lot of leg fertility rituals, because again, spring was all about making things grow. May Day was rowdy, cheerful, and deeply symbolic. It was nature's victory parade, and in some places, it got a little flirty too. Long winter, after all. Love in the air and the hay. Speaking of flirting, spring was a time for courtship, betrothals, and sometimes just sneaking off into the woods for some seasonal bonding. Many marriages happened after winter, when people were feeling alive again, and also had enough food to feed a wedding party. Some villages even had traditions where couples tested their compatibility by spending a night together fully clothed. Maybe, if they didn't want to kill each other by morning, it was a good sign. Romantic, right? The emotional shift. Winter made people quiet, careful, close to the edge. Spring brought back laughter, hope, new plans, and a general sense that life wasn't out to get you, at least not right now. It was more than just the season changing. It was a shift in mindset. Suddenly, you could imagine a better harvest, a new baby, a time when you weren't cold, sick, or out of onions. Generational relief. Older folks would look at the returning sun and say, "We made it again." And younger people would watch the animals give birth and think, "The world's still going." There was no calendar countdown, no weather app. But when the buds bloomed and the animals got frisky, everyone knew spring had arrived, and so had another chance. And so the cycle began again, with the fire now mostly out during the day, and the doors left open to let the breeze in. Life started over, slowly, messily, but full of purpose. Dark Age Britons didn't just live through the cold, they endured, they adapted, and when spring came, they rejoiced. They didn't need balloons or confetti, just a warm sun, a green field, and maybe a little ale. The end. Thanks for joining this journey through frozen mud, dried peas, goats, ghosts, and glowing hearths. Now take a deep breath, pull up your blankets, and remember, even the coldest winters always turn to spring. Sleep well.